Welcome, everybody. Hello, hello. Good morning for some. I guess good afternoon for others. So today we're going to be looking at, we're going to start off with some exercise work, just sketching some faster poses and then going into longer poses. And then after that, we're going to get into some alignment, some general alignment with the figure. Start to look at things like Q angle, things like what we got, pelvic tilt, get to some proportions on the face and alignments with the face. So yeah, let's hop into it. Definitely starting the morning off. Already had my coffee, so of course the tea. Not as good as coffee. I know people would argue with me for that. Happy Monday. Gray Brandon. Am I gray? Oh, you mean my hair? My old man hair? Yeah, I'm definitely getting gray, if that's what you mean. Okay, so let's get into it here. I'm just going to switch the old share to stream. So let's actually move things over for you guys so you can actually see it. So just got my canvas open. And I'm just going to start with some like 30-second poses. So again, the website I'm not going to show you guys because Twitch TOS doesn't allow any sort of nude model stuff. So it's called lineofaction.com, and you can get in there and set up whether you want to draw clothed or nude models. You can pick age range, and you can click something called class mode, which will start with faster poses and then get into longer poses for a specific amount of time. So I'm going to start with 30 minutes. And we will go from there. I personally, I mean, it's to everybody's taste, but personally, if I'm doing any sort of life drawing practice, I tend towards the nude model because clothing's great and figuring out what some folds look like is definitely something you want to be practicing. But in terms of kind of getting the body form, to not have that obscured by, billows of fabric is definitely a good way to make sure you're practicing anatomy properly. So let's get into it here. So I'm just going to start that off and just get into it. So let's get drawing. The nice thing about the Line of Action site is that it will count down. So we can kind of just get into some nice loose gestural strokes in here. You guys will maybe see, hopefully, a representation of what I'm looking at by my drawings. This person's holding a teacup in here and a book while sitting on a chair. Nice thing about fast poses that you really have no time to get into that kind of more precious detail. Just have to really kind of go for it really quick. I go fast enough, I get my mic bouncing around in the frame. Let's get some of those really quick strokes out. Trying to just focus. What I'm doing this, I am really trying to just focus on the larger forms, not worrying too much about verisimilitude. So, and it's been a kind of a theme in the last couple weeks of us not worrying about creating like final artwork out of this stuff, because that can be quite distracting from the warming up. We don't care as such about this artwork. We care about kind of tuning our hand-eye coordination and thinking about the way we're looking at shapes and organizing things really quickly on the frame. We can leave all of that precious artwork stuff until later, right? When we have warmed up. So I can already feel my hand going, or my shoulder starting to kind of get physically warm as the muscles are engaged. We've got 4 more at this time, and then I'll pause it for a second. So if you're into warming up, fire up line of action with me here and get into some figure sketching. Everybody can be doing it at the same time. And this is, I think, our last pose. I could be wrong, though. As maybe mentioned before, sometimes I get confused if I've been talking about this in class or whatnot, but going to a life drawing atelier or a place where they will life draw, let's just pause it there, is really good for you. Just even to relax and be doing some drawings. So, I definitely would, if you can, get out to something like that in community. Sometimes you'll even see it just like community centers. They'll have life drawing, that kind of thing. Sometimes it'll be clothed or nude, depends. But really useful to just break free of all of the like tiny detailing that people can tend to get into with the work. So try it out, see if you can find anything. Don't be shy, right? There's just other artists in there, and a lot of the times all you will have to bring is your drawing tools and your paper. I think sometimes in the drawing spots that I would go to, you can buy like newsprint for super cheap, and drawing tools, because sometimes you just forget, or you thought you brought drawing tools and you didn't. And then hopefully you get live models, which would be fun. This pen, this brush that I'm using is all right. I feel like I need something a little bit more kind of traditional, at least a little bit more interesting to look at in terms of a stroke. That's kind of nice. You get kind of a nice build up on that kind of brush. A little bit of a broad stroke. I get so used to drawing in Procreate because I tend to wake up in the mornings and just have my coffee and practice drawing something, personal stuff, things that aren't related to work. Right. And so, the brushes in there, I feel, are a little bit just more my taste than, say, Photoshop. I'm completely expecting Photoshop to buy out Procreate, or try to at least, or Adobe, I guess I should say, at some point. That's kind of a nice brush. Can make that a bit bigger and have those strokes be thick. Yeah, let's go with that one. That one feels pretty good. Okay, let's restart that. I'm just gonna break this out here. And get to it. Okay. So we've got this guy here. So even when I do longer poses, I'll tend to try and just like knock out the larger forms and get a sense of it, just like we were doing when I'd start with the the 30-second poses. I like 30-second poses, I guess, the most, more than 10-second poses, because 30 seconds, you know, is you can still kind of get the drawing done. I've done 10-second poses before, but it's sort of like you just start laying down lines, so you really have to go fast. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do notice that I'm just rushing at that point. It would help if I actually unpaused that. That was a little bit longer because I forgot to unpause, but that's fine. We'll start another one while this loads up. Hanging on to a rope. Good evening. Good morning. It's still morning for me, just barely. But I know it's late where you're at. Or later. So now we're into a 5-minute pose, so we can be a little bit, take our time with this one a little bit. Good morning. It's always interesting when I travel to places like that are at least far away from my home time zone. It's just weird to realize it's morning or night for those people. Say when I'm in Europe, everybody's waking up by the time I'm going to bed, or at least it's early in their day. So it's always strange. Yeah, it is. It's not bad for me normally. I think the worst jet lag I have is when I come back from Australia. Tends to be because I can't sleep on planes to save my life, but I just cannot adjust well when I come back. Trying to mark out those fingers really rough. This brush reminds me a little bit of willow stick, which is basically kind of like charred branch. And usually because the willow stick itself, as you scrub it down on the page, will become sharp at one end, blunt on another. So you can start to kind of get these really nice rhythmic lines out of the same piece of media. So it can kind of create some cool line variation in there. It is interesting. 5-minute pose seems to be long, but as soon as you kind of start to try and get everything in there, time just goes. You get into the longer poses, you can start to kind of look for anatomy, muscle groups, more specific landmarks, I guess you could say, in the body. I'll get to that next pose. Hope everybody had a good weekend. It was finally sunny where I'm at. It's been pretty brutal summer. I know it's just started over here, but it's been raining like crazy, which is not what 2020 needs right now. That's for sure. Not for me, at least. It's good for the forest fires, which we have all the time now. But still, need that sunlight. See the costal arch of the rib cage. Feeling too bad here. I'm only halfway through the timer. Sometimes on longer poses, I'll even, I could take this down and get into some, some more specific detailing, maybe in body parts, if I wanted. For us, I really do like to just warm it up, not get too precious about things. There's an energy that you kind of lose sometimes when you do that, when you're trying to kind of make something more accurate. You can start to make it a lot more rigid, which may not be the intent, right? So the side effect of doing this as well is that you can avoid that, or at least train your body, your arm, your hand-eye to get that right. Had an extended weekend. It's public holiday today, so you haven't been too productive. Nice. Well, you got to take the time sometimes with that stuff, right? So, good on ya. Don't get holidays too much in my line of work, but I do try and take them. Definitely had a plan to go to Italy this year. Before all of this stuff happened. So you can imagine, being that Italy was pretty hard hit, that trip fell by the wayside pretty quickly, which is unfortunate. Plan failed. Yeah, we were gonna go fly into Paris and go to Italy, stay in a villa there, and then go to Spain, go to up into France again, and then fly home after visiting a bunch of wine regions. My wife and I are wine dorks, but it'll just have to happen another time. Look forward to it. Okay, I'm going to start this one off with a little bit of a lighter touch, and then we'll maybe kind of mass out some of those shapes in there. Always really interested in the rhythms in hair as it hangs. It's always really interesting to play with. As shape, thinking about the rib cage in there, the obliques as they come down into the iliac crest of the body, glutes, and we could do that kind of resolve that a little bit with a bit more detail. So the Control Z button is definitely something you don't get in a life drawing atelier, but it's nice to kind of just hit your strokes and practice them in Photoshop. So it doesn't all have to be trying to mimic the real world media all the time. You can use the benefits of digital painting. This is a 10-minute pose, actually. I just looked up and saw the clock. Which is nice to be able to kind of spend some more time now on that detail. Start even kind of roughing in the light sources, at least the terminating edge of the shadow. Might not make those edges so intense. Just kind of map them out. One of the things you always want to watch out for when painting is, especially with young female faces or kids' faces, or even young men's faces, if you put too many lines in there, it can start to look a little bit like she's an old lady, which if you're drawing an old person, then great. But just those lines as contours can have an effect that you don't want sometimes. So watch out for that. Just kind of fill that in. You can start to even think about the shadow that she's casting. Okay, so that's not looking too bad for, this was a longer post. You know, some of this is getting kind of really inky and you know, messy, sort of more of like that willow stick or even India ink. One of the things we used to do in art school was actually just take a branch, like a willow branch, and dip it in ink and use that as like a pen quill. You'd always have to kind of load more ink on, and then when you put that down, there's a lot more ink, and then it would slowly kind of scale away. But that would create some interesting kind of line effect like this. There'd be some tragedies for sure. Too much ink, and then it just bleeds all over everything. But yeah, there we go. Right. So we did a bunch of 30s, then 1s, then 5s, then 110. I believe that last one was a 10. So that's just for us a good practice to kind of get going through some of these things. right? So definitely always, I mean, it's going to be me repeating this ad nauseum, but make sure that you loosen up. Start with something like the gesture we were doing there, or we can go back to blind contour as well. So good times to be had warming up. All right, so I wanted to kind of get into the alignment stuff today with some of the, I would say some of the alignments that people maybe overlook or erroneously represent when they're drawing figures. So I've got a couple, my two écorchés. Let's pull those up. Got écorché here, female and male. And we're just going to kind of start to take a look at some of the representations of alignment in the body for both male and female. And one of the first things that we can start to talk about, and we'll do it in the front view first, is the angle of thrust of a shape or of a form, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's grab a red in here. And so we have certain masses on the body that almost have like a direction of thrust in terms of the way the shape is pushing out in the body or in towards the body, whatever. On this female écorché model, which has been modeled after real life anatomy, we can start to kind of see that in, let's just start with the legs, for instance. We can kind of see this mass that almost feels like it's pushing out on the outside edge of the body there, right? We kind of get that bowing in that direction. And it starts lower and it creates almost like this angle that moves upwards, like so. It's likely to be different person to person and vary quite a bit. We'll talk about that when we get into the Q angle in a second, but that's what's going to start to feel more realistic, right? When you're representing a character of your own design, let's say. Let's take a look at the male. All right, we see that in the male a little bit more. The musculature has been developed a lot more than the female, and then male musculature is easier to develop than in males and females, I believe because of testosterone levels, but yeah, I do believe it's sort of like testosterone placement therapy or TRT is something that helps kind of muscle growth there and repair. So in this guy, we get that same kind of arch in the exterior edge. I am just going to double check that in here. Chris, this is great. Really have to spend more time setting up the Wacom and Photoshop to be more user friendly. Yeah, you'll get into a flow with that to feel kind of like what's good for your way of drawing. Doesn't take too long. I mean, by now I know everything I have to change every time I put a new driver on my computer or load Photoshop up. There's a few things that you will always have to have your way for it to work well. But yeah, glad you got your gear. So we're seeing that kind of this teardrop shape in the quad is more pronounced on the male, but even then you can kind of use that to get that sense of direction of thrust for that body part in there, right? So upwards and to the exterior for him. You could follow that rhythm down in through the leg as well. And you can see that kind of glance off from side to side in through the body there. So these are the kinds of rhythms, angles of thrust, alignments that you want to be paying attention to when you're looking at reference, right? Trying to detect that. What you'll see which doesn't look real in a lot of novice drawing is you just get this kind of tube, right, as a leg a lot of the times, because we think of, as kids, you may draw a stick person, right? Like so, and you're just really simplifying some of those forms. And we don't want to do that, right? We're not drawing stick people typically in commercial art. So we have to pay attention to some of the more complex nuances of the body in there. So we've got that in that upper portion of the leg. Let's switch back to the female body form here. So we've got that kind of pushing out that way. We see that energy moving that part of the leg outward. When we get down into the knee, it does feel like it kind of presses in this direction, right? And that has to do with the Q angle of the female and male bodies. It's more noticeable in the female. We'll take a look at that here. So what's happening is this little arch in here is the top of the pelvis, right? And we get in female bodies, more specifically, you get a wider pelvis, right? Which helps hold up the organs and babies if the person is pregnant, right? Where males don't have to have that. So males tend to have a little bit more of a square pelvis, whereas females, it tends to kind of almost, let's say, flatten out or blossom outward a little bit more, because that pelvis is wider at that area. The trochanter, or where the femur attaches to the pelvis, has to sit wider. It's further out at this alignment to the ground. So we'll just kind of draw kind of this medial line in the body there. And so what happens is, for the legs to come back underneath the mass of the body, right, and for that femur to attach to the outside of the hip, you get an angle in here, right, from this direction. And you can imagine it kind of moving up into the hip. And so there's this sort of, and we'll just draw on this side, there's this sort of angle that's happening in here, that where the femur is kind of moving to attach back down to the leg and get that lower leg and the foot underneath the mass so that the person doesn't fall over. And that angle is called the Q angle. And in females, one of my notes here, it tends to be, in women probably as the body grows into its adult form, 18 to 20 degrees. I mean, you can think of it as 18 degrees. Are you going to actually be drawing 18 degrees and getting out a protractor and making sure that's all right? Probably not, right? But that's what we're taking a look today at, is the general kind of sense of the alignments or thrusts of these body parts. And so you're going to want this leg to feel like it's arching back in at some more detectable angle. Do we have that in male bodies? Yes, it's 11 to 13 degrees. But you'll notice if I kind of pop back and forth between these two, it's the shape that we're creating is a lot less noticeable. So if I were to create a basic kind of form here, and it's almost like this, as I draw this kind of looks like a pencil skirt, right, as a base shape. But we do get this taper that is a lot more noticeable. And then that angle moves back up in towards the waistline. Okay, and then when we see it on the male, this just looks a lot more square in here, right? There is a subtle taper downwards, but for males, because the hips don't need to support that other aspect of human development and gestation, males haven't evolved that way, right? And so we get something that's a little bit more square there versus something like that. So it can be, these shapes can start to tell the tale of whether the sex of the character is male or female, right? And so if you're drawing these characters and say you tend towards drawing males all the time, right? But then you go to create a female character, maybe you just even have been drawing males for projects for a certain amount of time, and you kind of got your mind into the right place with what those structures look like. And then you go to draw a female and you're like, something's off with this body. It's just like, I get the hip to waist ratio and the upper body right, but when I get down into the lower body, it just kind of feels weird to me. It can a lot of the times be that you're drawing more kind of male hips down to the legs at that point, instead of considering that the hips are wider on the female pelvis, and then they taper into the knee at a more aggressive angle. I mean, 18 degrees doesn't sound like much, but it's noticeable, right? So it's always something that you want to be paying attention to there. So that's sort of like the hip region. I mean, even when we're looking at this form, let's get rid of that shape. When we're looking at this form, if I were to generalize this, it almost feels like this drops almost like straight down here, and then it flares up to the top there, right? So it's quite a different form, where we could generalize the female form the other way, where there is that taper up to the shoulders for sure, but the waist is a distinct smaller width, and then the hips go larger again, and then that's when you get the quote-unquote hourglass shape, right? So if we're simplifying male versus female, kind of think about males as dropping down to this flat Y or V shape, and then females getting more of that hourglass shape because of the nature of that anatomy. So food for thought there. When we get into the lower leg, let's just zoom in a little bit on that. We have these two masses, well, these directional masses. We have this inside sort of shape in here. That's the calf down there. And that seems to kind of sweep upwards like this, right? Kind of pushes out from there upwards slightly. When we get down into the lower portion, you get the little landmarks of the ankles, of the tibia and fibula down below, right? And the outside drops down lower, and the inside is a higher form, or that bump in your ankle is higher up than the outside. Let's say that again. The inside bump of your ankle is set higher up than the outside edge, that outside bump, right? And so, you get these angles that maybe move inward, or at least in that direction. So we've got this, and we've got this. And one of my favorite examples, I think, I can't remember if it was artist Paul Richards, kind of thought of it as if you're drawing that lower leg, you can almost think of it as like an angry face, right? With that, the way those volumes or those shapes thrust in different directions, right? So sort of almost like this unhappy face like that, right? So this would be the ankles and the upper leg, right? That's the direction. And you get the ankles higher up on the inside, lower down on the outside. So that's sort of like that look. And then of course you get into the patella and up into the upper portion of the leg. But that's just a nice way, and so many different artists have different ways of kind of thinking about these structures, but that's a nice way of kind of thinking about how those forms come off of the rest of the leg. There is sort of this curvature to the bone, tibia in there, right? So it's not dropping just straight down from the knee. And this is something, even when you guys are looking at reference, is try and figure out where the ground plane is and try and draw a perpendicular line up from that ground plane. If it's a crazy cambered shot, in perspective, it can be a little bit more difficult, because we're taking a nice flat shot of the character here. We can kind of see that by just drawing a line straight down. You can kind of draw that medial line. She's a little bit off center, but that's fine. And then you can just drop these lines down to see sort of what shapes are produced out of that, right? So see the knee there, we drop down from there. You can see that leg still starts to arc inwards to catch the weight of the body. And that's something else that's a major driver of everything, is the physics of standing up in the opposite direction to gravity. Is you have to be putting your feet, those things that are planted, balancing you, underneath the main mass, right, of the body. And that tends to be the torso, right? The heaviest mass. And of course, the legs are another heavy mass. So you're going to get those legs back underneath you. The firmer way of holding your weight would be to plant your legs sort of wider stance, right? That's when like you get fighters posing. They'll always have that kind of wide stance because you can get tipped over really easy when kind of having your feet together. You can kind of just be knocked over really easy. So if you know somebody's about to push you, you're not going to keep your feet tight together, right? So thinking about the mass and how it's been kind of propped up is really good for you to understand when you're looking at things why those angles are there and what the function of the body is. Something you might see with somebody that has knocked knees is the knees will come together more and almost maybe touch at the middle, and then the legs will kind of move back out in the opposite direction. For that to happen, I mean, I'm definitely not a doctor, but for that to happen, one of the things, and I know this from experience, is a fallen arch in the foot. That foot collapsing down where our feet would be kind of positioned up like this. If that arch fails, then it pulls that leg in, which can pull that knee in this way, and it's sort of like a house of cards falling apart, right? So you may need insoles, for instance, if you're somebody that has a fallen arch like I do, so that it doesn't put unnecessary stress on the knee, right, and give you that kind of knock knee look or feeling. So if your character's wandering around with the knees kind of touching and you've got that angle difference, and say you did that based on reference, it could be that the model had that issue, right? That physical issue. Again, it could be many things maybe that caused that, but we'll leave that up to doctors. Okay. So we get a sense of, how the basic sense and how that structure moves through the body in that lower section. When we get into the upper sections of the body, you will see some of the masses, especially when the hand is pronating, which is just sort of opening the palms up to the camera, like we have her here. You will get some of that, those forearm muscles kind of pushing outwards and upwards like that. In her musculature, we're not seeing too much in how her bones and body part have kind of developed, because she's just so slight a frame. Depending on how you want to look at it, you could say that the bump or the inside of the elbow, it could be pushing out that way on her body specifically. So that might be something to pay attention to. Let's look at the male character here. So if I'm judging based on this mass in here, we could say that it's moving outwards. Or if you wanted to start from the elbow, then it pushes the opposite direction, right? I would probably tend towards this as a mass than the elbow, right? So we can kind of see that it spans across the arm that way. Biceps pretty uniform, and then the deltoid is this kind of angular, almost flat muscle that connects into the humerus and up into the infraspinatus. So, I mean, there's not too much in terms of thrust we can see there. When we do start looking at the side of the body, we can start to see some other things happening there. So as we're looking at this form here, we can think about the underlying structure of the rib cage and how that's positioned with the spine, right? And in general, the chest or the rib cage tends to feel like it's thrusting upwards, right? That's where you get that kind of proud chest, or the Superman pose or the Superwoman pose, whatever, right? That proud chest really rising up. When somebody has bad posture, you'll see that start to tilt downward, right? More of like I guess an anterior tilt, which we'll talk about the hips in a second. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. If I had a character that I wanted to feel kind of like they're slowly collapsing into space, then I would tilt all of that down. So you can really play with the posture because the spine is a very pliable structure in the body, right? For good reason. So we get that kind of movement up this way. You could think about the front of the collarbone and the 7th cervical vertebrae, that one that you can feel in the back there, as having a directional thrust in through the neck this way, right? That it's not just straight across, right? When you put a t-shirt on backwards, you'll really feel it, right? Because of the fabric that's usually higher, stretched out so that that's higher and this is lower, now sits right up against your neck, right? And it feels like it's pulling down on the back. So there is a difference there in terms of direction, right? This is lower, this is higher, for instance, in the collarbone to vertebrae on the back. But otherwise, the rib cage feels like it's moving in that opposite direction in there. Okay. You could look at the chin to the base of the skull, the back, as being a specific angle to look for, right? Rather than, what you might do is draw the jaw and then the back of the skull, because you're not paying attention to that, right? So we know that it should be higher up and move to the back like that, making room for that sweep through into the neck, right? I'm running out of room. Don't get into that habit of drawing things incorrectly because you run out of room. So we get that movement through there. I think of that rib cage kind of moving up through the back, up this way, right? And I can start to kind of get into the curve of the lumbar spine. So that's sort of the way as I'm sketching and making these characters, I'm watching out for those angles of alignment or directional thrust of the body there. When we do get into past sort of the belly button here, things do start to move and tilt a little bit more away from the horizon line. For instance, if this character is standing straight up, you'll see that the iliac crest in here of the pelvis is tilted in this direction. Excuse me. So the abductors will move down and attach to the pubic bone in the front. And so what we get at that point is an obvious angle to the pelvis. And we can see that if we load up the female, let's get rid of those lines. You can see that little pelvis in there and that tilt that seems to be traveling in this direction, right, from the horizon. So it definitely exists in there, and then you can see the abductors moving down to attach to the pubic bone in the front. So you don't want the pelvis to feel like there's a posterior tilt where you get the tailbone sort of sweeping up underneath, right, and getting the femur there, where that pelvic bone starts to kind of look like it's flat like this, because then it's going to be that the spine has to straighten up like that, and then you're going to get a very strange, it'll be almost like if you're doing hip tilts in the gym or something like that to kind of find your alignment. It'll feel like you're really pushing your tailbone up under your butt and straightening your back, right? And that sometimes can be something that happens to somebody with bad posture. They're going to have to kind of lean out over their body to kind of set that mass properly over top of their feet, right? So that's when you can get some interesting bad posture. When would I want to do that? Probably a character that's not in good physical condition for whatever reason, right? I mean, when we're painting and drawing for these projects, it could be anything. It could be a zombie. It could be just like a bookshop owner that's never got off their stool, right? And you kind of want to make them feel a little bit decrepit. It could be somebody with physical ailment or whatever, right? But you want to start to think about those angles that we're dealing with those masses and which direction they're traveling. If once again you find that you're creating characters and it's like something's wrong with this, right? It can be that. It can be many things, but that can maybe be that, oh, my hips are kind of twisted up. It feels like this person's like thrusting the hip upward instead of me getting that nice direction, or that nice kind of angle in the hip tilt, right? So that is, so it almost looks like a bean, or the shape that kind of, I guess even like a sausage shape or a pickle shape, right? It is curving this way. There's that lumbar curve. You get the chest moving up, the hips moving down this way. So, and that's the person standing in a neutral pose, right? We can embellish that, like somebody sticking their butt out and really arching their spine. It's not going to be a natural pose, but it could be like, say, a provocative pose or something like that, depending on the project you're working on. So we want to make sure that feels like it's actually happening. Now, if somebody has an anterior tilt, the side effect of that is going to be that, I just mentioned it, their butt will stick out a lot more, but their spine really has to bend now to get back to it's the positioning the mass on top of the feet, right? So you'll tend to get maybe sort of like somebody with a belly that's hanging out, and you might kind of start getting that head really slumping forward, right? So I'm sure everybody, maybe some of us, my posture is not great. Maybe some of us will start to kind of get this shape happening if we don't kind of engage our abs and make sure that we're exercising and strengthening those muscles. But those things can really start to throw the body off. And the body is, you're going to always try and stack your weight properly over your feet so you don't tip over, right? And if parts of those body parts are kind of not moving in the right directions, there are other body parts that have to counterbalance that, right? So that's when you get this weird shifting of the body. Instead of that chest being nice and proud, that chest might kind of start to sag downward, right? So very interesting way of those things kind of reacting to the way the body's being put through the motions or not put through motion at all, right? So we think about that in the body kind of tilt in there, making sure it doesn't go too much posterior or too much anterior, either this way or this way, right? And just kind of a nice degree of angle on that, and that will feel like a good neutral pose. But if you want that anterior tilt, right, where the kind of the glute will stick out more, then you can do that. It's still something a human can do, and it's just same as the posterior tilt, where somebody's tucking in their tailbone. It might be they're reacting to something, right? So you can do that if it makes sense, but just watch out if your characters are starting to feel strange, that it's not something like the tilt, the pelvic tilt. So when we get into the lower legs in here as well, right, we can see that this feels like it's more angled downward, and that from the front of that leg, if we drew a line straight down, we see this negative space, almost like what we were doing with our previous life drawing, right? Is drawing that negative space. But there's all of that overhang, right, of the upper portion of the leg. And that does kind of sweep back up into the hip there, right? So we get that shape, but this can also be that weird stick person leg where if you're drawing the human body, you get to the legs and then for whatever reason you draw a knee like this and you draw all the way down. Even if you were to draw the muscles, right, and you were to draw up like that, that's why that feels strange, right? That generalization of that feels strange because it's not correct. Again, you can always find edge cases in human existence where somebody has a body that's been developed that way. But for the most part, averages will be more like this, right? And so let's tie it back into why, once again, just so we can see the full body in there, is we have a mass here, and we have a mass Still got that interesting brush here. We have kind of like a bigger mass in here. So if I were to kind of figure out, I'd say maybe the general middle of that would line up. We would see probably something straight through there, right? If I draw that straight down to the feet, we've got a nice plant on that foot shape to actually stand that up, right? But the rhythms of the body kind of move in and out of that line, so they have to be balanced at some point. So you see a lot of the body starting to kind of move out this way and out that way, right? So on this side of that line. And so to counterbalance that, some of that body has to swing out onto the other side, right? So that's all mass that has to be balanced, right? You see that in the shoulders out this way and the back of the head that way, right? So we could probably slice down there and weigh both sides, and they would tend to be even, right, in terms of the total mass of that. And when you're drawing characters and they start to look like they're leaning forward or leaning back, or they just feel off balance, that's probably why, is we haven't stacked that mass to a line over top of the platform, which is our feet, to make sure that that feels good. Right. And then if something else feels weird, maybe it is that those masses aren't, those rhythms aren't moving in and out of that center line or that medial line on the body. Right. So too far backwards, for instance, we don't have enough platform out the back of our leg, or our calcaneus or our heel, to stop us from tipping backwards. Right. So if I start to draw a character that's sort of slightly leaning this way, you're going to feel it, right? You're going to feel that kind of mass of this object being too far out behind itself, right? Hanging out this way, and it's going to feel like it's just going to topple over, right? I actually cut the écorché out in Photoshop a little bit, because the way they flatten some of the surfaces that this thing stands on, it's not quite balanced. So I believe the female character, she feels like she's leaning back a little bit too much, and it's probably too difficult for you guys to see, but that's just a manufacturing issue, right? When I look at her and I feel like she's going to tip over backwards, that's what's triggering it for me. It's like I feel most of her mass is kind of moved to the back. So I cut her out at the ankle and just tilted her up a little bit until that felt balanced, right? So that's something that I'm paying attention to when you can see sort of the line that I cut out here. So that's what's happening in there. And when we get down to the knee, this sort of, the lower leg sweeps back in, and it really does almost look like a crescent shape, right? Of course it ends in a blocky ankle, but it does feel like it's a sweeping crescent shape that sweeps back in towards the feet that way, right? So you can almost look at it that way. And that's a straight leg. We're not bending our tibia and fibula, because that breaks the tibia and fibula. So just be careful with that. And then that sweep that moves back up this way just creates this really beautiful rhythm through the body, right? You see this kind of, we could generalize this sweep up through here. This sweep in the back up into the neck, right? Because that's higher than the front, the clavicle. So we just get these movements, these sweeping sort of movements through the body in here. And almost like one catches the other, and it sweeps all the way down through. That center line is just a very beautiful, evolved form. So it's a lot more noticeable. Let's take a look at that. It's a lot more noticeable in the female figure than the male figure. The male figure becomes a bit more blocky, right? But the same forces are at play with the back kind of sweeping into the front. To my knowledge, there isn't a difference in hip tilt, male to female. I could be wrong. I haven't done too much research in that regard. But say the glute, as it gets more developed, is squaring off there, right? The quad gets a bit blocky as it gets more muscular in there. Certainly the calf does as well. So you see it's sort of stilted, right? That those flowing rhythms that we saw in the female form don't necessarily come through as well in the male form, but they're there. So you'd still want to observe that in the structures as you draw them, right? So is there any tip or hack to measure abs height between the chest and the pelvis? Yeah, let's go look at that. Let's look in the front view on the male, because that'll be something that's a little bit more kind of structural. So the way I'll tend to figure out where my abs are, let's start a new layer here, is and this comes from actually paying attention to where the pelvis is, right? A few things in there, right? So there is this costal arch in here. That's the rib cage. So knowing where the ground or the foundations of the body are, the skeletal structure, that thing exists there. And then we have the pelvis underneath the obliques, which are on males. The obliques are more developed and tend to kind of sag over. That's why on females you don't tend to see a big teardrop sort of oblique, is because it's not as prominent, right? And then hips are wider, so that iliac crest or that bony part on the hips sticks out more, right? So I look for those. I look for crotch, the kind of crotch base, or you can almost think about the underwear kind of shape on the body. And I think about those abductors as positioned and relative to those two body forms. So we get the pubic bone, and then the abductors will reach up around that part of the body. So they're meant to grab the rib cage and pull it towards the pelvis, right? You'll get into the serratus, which help us kind of bind left and right, or kind of twist this way. And then the obliques will really get us to be able to pull left and right. So I figure out where that main mass will go first. It tucks up underneath the pecs to grab the rib cage, right? So that's where those first muscles will kind of show up. Let's delete this. You'll see these top guys in here. And then the belly button will kind of mark where the halfway point is between the next 8 muscles, right? So you get kind of this group in here. Then you get the six pack is the upper set, not the ones that attach below your pecs, and not the well, I guess it does actually include the lower set that run to the pelvis, right? On somebody that's very, very lean, you'll actually start to see all these muscles, but the six pack generally develops in that top range in here, right? These guys down in here are really hard to see, and these guys up in here are smaller and less prominent. When somebody does, like, say, a weightlifter or somebody that's in some sort of fitness challenge thing, if they've got really lean fat content, then you'll start to see all these things pop out, and then you get the serratus on the side in there. But the belly button will kind of mark that lower set, and that tends to be where your elbow sits, right? So 4 of the 6-pack sits above the belly button, and then 2 below, and then you've got those hidden muscles above and below that, right? If we go to the female form, you'll start to kind of really see that if, this female character's more fit, we start to get that lower pair, right? And then that upper pair up in here, and then she'll have these little muscles in there, and then these ones that move down to the pubic bone. So for me, I'd figure out where the pelvis is, where the costal arch is. I tend to put my belly button somewhere in between them, and then I can kind of sort of like landmark from there. I know that we've got 2 below, and then the longer kind of fascia that attaches to the pelvis, and then we've got those 2 strong ones up above that, and then well, that would be kind of more this one and this one. And then that would lead up into the rib cage set. So, and then, I mean, the obliques are so small on this female character, right? But you can see them in there, and they're a part of that family, right? The core muscles that will help us understand where those things go. Would I see this engaged a lot more if, say, she was binding one side? Yeah, right. You're going to start to see that kind of grow a little bit more. It's certainly going to be a lot more noticeable on the guy, right? As that binds, it's going to get bigger, and the other side's going to stretch as he's kind of twisting one way or the other. So, I tend to make it too long sometimes. Yeah, I mean, it can be that you're just not placing those masses correctly, and so you're getting you know there's a six pack in general when really there's more muscles than that, or more kind of volumes than that. You'll just start to put them somewhere, right? And I always love when people just draw abs like this. It's like this weird sort of beetle look, and it's just like they cross this over like a Ninja Turtle shell. It's it's good. You're getting there, but you're not really speaking to the actual forms of the body. So you see that a lot in novice artwork. But I would say kind of just look for the belly button. It sits a little bit below that intersection on this guy. And so, but that's sort of like where I gauge it from there. And then I think about those muscles leading into the pubic bone, and then out into the iliac crest. Those obliques sit on the side of that, right? You are detecting that rib cage in there, and then the serratus kind of attached to the side of that. So, adding to the notes. Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, as an aside, I think that a lot of errors come from not paying attention to the fact that there are structures that hold the muscles up, right? The muscles that have to attach to these hard points to be able to move the body around, right? And so when people don't think about the skeleton, they think about muscles, and there's no relationship then, right? And so those muscles end up just kind of going wherever they want because the artist doesn't know. It's like, okay, well, the bicep, what does it actually do, right? It attaches to the forearm and to the upper arm or the humerus, right? So radius and ulna down here, humerus up here for the bones. And it has to attach to both of those so it can pull one close to the other, right? That's how you get people flexing, right? If it were attached to your rib cage and your and your humerus, for instance, well, that would be your more of like your deltoid, right? Where it's attached to this core part of your body and then your humerus. So that's how this whole thing moves. This moves independently. So someone like Loomis will say that he doesn't see any material reason why you should memorize these muscle names. I mean, it's good to reference them. I would say that's the reason why. But you just need to know where they are and where they attach to, right? At the very least. Right, so starting to think about that, even looking at boring references of skeletons and muscles and how they attach, you're learning about, the function of that thing. So that also allows you to think about when I'm drawing the superhero character, the zombie character, that there has to be space in this area or that area for the bone where that muscle attaches to, right? And then you start to kind of build this whole sense of landscape of the human figure. And you go, then the last time I drew a character, I completely just cut out the, the spine section of the mid portion of the body. And it would seem like the rib cage and the pelvis would grind together, right? Because I wasn't thinking about that stuff. So it's really good to make sure that, you're thinking about that stuff. And then slowly over time, you'll, just even thinking about these directions of thrust, okay, that's what that muscle looks like as it's attached to the body, right? And if you delve deeper into it, you can start to think, well, it would have to look that way if it's going to attach the body and be next to this muscle and blah, 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 right? It's going to have to kind of take certain shape for it to be able to work. So you can really dive deep into anatomy on that level. Right. And it's not a bad thing to do because you're going to just have a better idea of where these things are. And comic book artists and manga artists and anime artists, obviously, animators, they'll tend to have a really good sense of anatomy. And because they have that sense, they can start to do things with the body, right? They can create a rotten old zombie that's smashed apart, or they can create a overly like a hypertrophic muscular male or female character where every muscle's rippling. They're not guessing where they go, they know where they go, right? I mean, they're just making them bigger and thinking about that mass, right? So it can be quite liberating once you know that stuff. And because we tend to tell human stories all the time, probably a good idea, right? So let's go back to the side view and just see what else we may have missed. So down in the lower portion of the leg, right, we see that on the male character, you get this kind of sweep. So this isn't straight back here. And one of the things I can't even remember where I heard it, but we talk about concave, convex shapes. So a concave shape is something that kind of caves in, right? Like imagine you're in a cave with an overhang, you're in the cave, right? A convex shape is something that's more bulbous, it bulbs out or kind of swells outward. There are more, when you're drawing the human body, aim to have those convex shapes more than those concave shapes, right? As much as possible. Now the base, like we can start to think about, okay, well, would there be shapes that I could generalize as being convex or concave? Yeah, the sweep of these angles is going to create something in general that looks like that, but the actual muscles that are creating that shape are a group of muscles that, you know, and this is an exaggeration, right? But that create this arch that way. They're not actually flat a lot of the time, right? Even if it's the most minute convexity, right? You want that convex shape to be in there. And we can see if, as we look at this male figure specifically, that we have that little convex shape there, convex shape, abs, each convex shapes in and of themselves as they move up. I could generalize them as a large convex shape, right? The pectoral is a series of convex shapes that are layered over top of each other. The deltoid is as well, right? Back into the tricep. And so if you keep that in the back of your mind, you can angle towards the stuff. You can still generalize. I mean, you see that a ton when you're doing gesture drawing, right? You're just kind of sweeping through and you're creating these concave shapes, these convex shapes, very basic. But say I was doing that as a sketch, I would come back later and make sure that the volumes felt right in the body. So let's take a look at the female. Get rid of those and zoom in a little bit on her. But because the muscles aren't as developed and bulbous, right, it won't seem as though those convexities are as easy to see. But she's got smaller convex shapes, right? Even these little guys that are stretched over her rib cage and they're very thin, they're little kind of squished convexities, right? As we get into those other forms. So in this case, it's really hard to see it. It's mild, but it is there, right? So don't get into the habit of just drawing straight lines on these things all the time. They are muscles that are these fibers that pinch to these ligaments that stick onto a bone, right? And when they pull tight, they become larger, right? They fill, you know, that blood fills and contracts that. And so that's why when you use your muscles a lot, you get that acid buildup because there's that kind of, it's not dumping enough of the, what is it? It's sort of like cellular waste, I guess. There's a buildup of that acid that needs to go away. That's why you need to rest, right? But it's all of that mechanical thing. So when kind of going through, say, the course in CG Spectrum, you know, we start to talk about the function of things and helping people understand the way these things work so that you're not guessing, right? Because you can learn that shape exists and draw things in a very kind of myopic way, knowing that this just has to look like that shape. But it's always better to know why, I think, because then you can start to manipulate that. If it looks like this because of that, then I want it to look a different way. Then I can start to think about how the mechanics work, and I can start to, connect the dots myself if I'm doing something that wasn't specific to a specific shape that I've built, right? Sort of like when you see those how to draw an owl or how to draw, whatever. And it's sort of like, draw this circle, draw these two little circles, draw this sphere or whatever, right? This oblong ellipse shape, and then put the feathers on. There's your owl. Well, instead of, that, thinking about an owl, thinking about its skull, its body, its, how the wings come together, the volumes of that. And then I can go, okay, well, when his wings are out, he's doing this. And I can actually draw the owl in a lot more of a different situation because I now know the mechanics, right? If I relay back to those simple drawing, how to draw, right, with basic shapes, it doesn't really help me beyond that one specific look. So that can be a bit of a trap for people when they just start remembering symbols rather than structures and volumes that form, right? So I'm kind of going off on a tangent there, but it's always good to know or to think about the mechanics and functionality of things, because that can start to educate us on those more unseen parts of the body, right? Like the pelvis and what we were talking about there as being the reason why, say, the female figure looks different than the male in that sexual dimorphism, right? So, yeah, we feel that a little bit here. Whoops. And so we get kind of this drops down a little bit more straight. The female calf, for instance, isn't as kind of chiseled, so it sweeps nice and soft into there. But it does feel like that's the angle in that direction, right? So if we matched that with the front, where we know the outside edge of the leg is the higher part, then we know in total, like, there's this curvature of the mass, that volume that moves out in space, right? So if I were to kind of draw that separately and look at this leg in 3/4, we would get a mass that maybe starts to feel like this, right? As that curves outward. And I'm just going to draw a little hollow leg in there, right? And as that moves out to the foot, we'd see maybe something that looks more like that. Now I'm exaggerating it a little bit. And we remember our angry face, right? So that outside ankle would be lower, that inside ankle would be higher. And we would get something that starts to look like that as it moves back into the foot. So that's just me thinking about connecting the dots between the angle of thrust of those two masses, or the mass at different angles, right, of view, different perspectives. So we could take a look at the body in the round. This is why seeing things in 3D is really good for you, because you can start to kind of mentally map that volume on your own to get to a final sort of more realistic representation, right? Let's look at the male. So we don't see it here. I mean, we can see it a little bit in the écorchés. The muscle mass on, say, the glutes is a lot different male to female as well, because males don't carry a lot of fat around there because they don't need to protect organs in that region as much as females do. Say if they are pregnant with a baby, they need to kind of protect that space a bit more with insulation. So in males, that you get this really interesting, you can really detect this on male ballerina. I don't know if there's a distinction between male and female, but they're tending to wear tights, and so you can see their glutes, right? So me, when I'm at the ballet, I'm watching sort of gesture and pose and anatomy, right, on male and female ballerinas. And just like, it's really impressive to see, right? I'm cluing into the sexual dimorphism between those volumes, right? And being an art geek, well, maybe I should just be enjoying the show, but that's sort of part of why I like it. It's just a very beautiful representation of anatomy and pose and gesture and stuff. But you can really start to see the differences between that in the round, right? So the same as sort of like the musculature on males when they have, like, say, the ballerinas, like very form-fitting clothing. You get to see all the like shelf kind of blocky parts of the body, whereas the female dancers, they tend to be just like very fluid, and they tend to be slight of frame, right? And not, you're not going to get a lot of voluptuous women doing that necessarily, because it's being, I guess, light on your feet is going to be something that's important to that job, right? So yeah, anyway, very interesting way of looking at it. Of course, you get into other kinds of dance and you see that it's, you know, you have all different sorts of body types. So just contextual, right? So so that's sort of just a look at those things for us. I'm trying to think about other kind of angles of alignment, but I think that's sort of like a good basis. This guy, I've tilted him backwards a little bit. I think he suffers a tiny bit from maybe being a bit too far forward. I can see it when I'm looking at the sculpture a little bit here, and I think it's just a production issue where their ankles may set and cool and have the statuette kind of leaning too far forward or too far back. What we're seeing is there's a lot of that mass out in front and not a lot of it out the back, right? So it seems like he's almost kind of leaning in a little bit here, and he's going to really have to try and make his foot rigid so he doesn't fall forward, right? It's like when somebody is inebriated or drunk or something like that, you'll see them kind of like not be good at balancing, or if they're sick or they have vertigo, right? You see them kind of stumble and kind of catch themselves. It's because that is quite a lot of mass up high, that if you start just tipping it forward, your feet aren't great platforms. They're pretty good, but they're not great platforms. They can just not be enough and you'll tumble forward, right? So just being really aware that people will know when somebody's going to fall, even if they're not artists geeking out about this stuff, right? So if they see your character and it looks like they're doing a smooth criminal lean, right, then it's going to feel odd to them, right? So you just have to kind of keep your eye on that. But yeah, so there we go. And what how you would practice these things is I would really kind of focus on working on different body parts at different times. So you're not like, I'm going to work on the angle of thrust of the hips and the leg and the chest and the neck and all of this stuff. I mean, it's still something you can do, but if you continually practice what the pelvis looks like from different directions throughout the time that you're practicing in that one session, you'll probably kind of remember that more. And then the next time, maybe you look at the masses in the upper torso and so on, right? And then maybe you practice male, female, that kind of thing. Could be really useful. So just something to think about, right? And it's going to, I think, have a huge impact on your art as long as you're paying attention to that stuff. And even just going back through your own art or other people's art to see if things feel balanced. You know, you can put on your critique hat and kind of look through that stuff to see what feels good. Okay, these écorché sculptures are these ones specifically are from 3D Total. Not like I'm slinging for 3D Total, but you could probably find other écorché elsewhere. They're not cheap, but the reason why I have these things is for reference, right? This isn't every male shape. This isn't every female shape. They're averages, approximations, maybe even on the ideal side, right? Which, believe it or not, tends to be what we have to produce for commercial art, right? A lot of the time. There's still, you're going to be doing characters that are maybe heavy set or very emaciated or very thin, right? So in those cases, understanding the anatomy and the angle of thrust for, say, an obese body would be something else that I would look at, right? Because that muscle and bone is one thing, but the addition of fat and large amounts of fat will start to react to gravity and still be kind of attached to different parts of the body and allow the body to still move. So what does that look like? And it is different for different people, right? So you can start to see like the complexities of these things start to kind of compound, and it's a lot. It's a lot to remember. The opposite side, emaciated bodies, are really, really, really kind of lean bodies where you almost like the muscle mass is gone, and there's no fat. Then it becomes very skeletal, right? So you do start to see every single rib because the muscles aren't so big over top, right? You'd see the clavicle and how that connects, the acromion process, which is sort of the bony thing that sticks out of the top of the shoulder, right? The actual arm bones, the femurs, as they lead into the patella and the knee joint. You could definitely tell like somebody that's been starved, right, or has starved themselves, for reference of the human body. However sad that is, it is what happens to the human form if not nourished properly, right? So that's like, if you were ever drawing a character that you're supposed to come across as this sort of malnourished person, then there you go, right? So you'll see this a lot in zombie artwork, right? Which, if you saw my other stream, that zombie wasn't one that was emaciated. But as the sort of body withers, right, that might be something that you go to is, I got to really make sure I know what the skin draped over the human skeleton looks like, so that I get it right. In certain zombie games, there's always that this person's just become a zombie, so they've got the red eyes or whatever's going on, and they have a normal physiology, or a normalized physiology, right, an idealized form. So you wouldn't worry about it at that point. Anyway, I'm just trying to point out different considerations for knowing what body type you're using, and then obviously having practiced that. So I would definitely do that if I had just been tasked with creating a certain character. I want to make sure that I've nailed that body type, and then I can watch out for any inconsistencies with the way I'm building those masses. Okay, so kind of almost going back to when we were doing our sketching to warm up. When you are doing the sketching, you can be looking for these structures now, right? You can be looking for these alignments and tweaking them as you are doing your life drawing, right? You realize the way you're sketching it, the character's like leaning forward too much, and now they feel like they're off balance, right? Let's go see. So this character specifically, her feet are planted apart, right? So creating this kind of triangle shape, which you'll see in all sorts of architecture to carry load, is a triangle, right? So for her, that mass is sitting up in between those legs. As long as it's positioned squarely over those feet, or a line you can draw between those feet, then she's good, right? Counterbalancing things with her arms stuck out to the side is also going to be a way she can balance, right? If I'm up on my tippy toe on one foot and I have my arms together, that's going to be a super hard situation for me to keep my balance. I'm going to fall over. Me specifically, because I got terrible balance. But yeah, right? It's something to think about with that, but I could test that. I could see if she felt like she was going to topple over. Even if I took her and rotated her, right? If I rotated her this way, and she had her foot on the ground, kind of maybe it would start to kind of pivot out this way. You're going to feel like all that mass, the contact point is here, all that mass is tumbling this way, right? Almost maybe she's doing like a cartwheel. That's a lot more obvious than if you just had her slightly off balance, right? But that's the same thing that we're detecting, is that there's no way that mass is going to be able to stay on that foot. It's just not physically possible. She'd have to have like suckers on her feet and have crazy muscle control to do that. And some contortionists and fit people can do that. But we're going to detect this and we're going to go, nah, that doesn't make sense, right? And so you don't want that to kind of be, unless it's intentional, you don't want that to be the way people land on your artwork. because you're not paying attention to it now, right? So that alignment matters huge. So this guy, I was paying attention to that when I was drawing this guy specifically, even though I wasn't telling you guys I was doing it. I'm thinking about kind of, there's only this little contact point on this foot here, and he's got his other full foot planted on the ground. So we've kind of got that vector of stability, right? So his legs are kind of feeling a little planted apart still. We could think about where that mass is and then drop sort of a line down in between and think about where that hits in the legs there, right? So he's really leaning out over this knee. So what would the risk on this guy be? That he maybe falls forward a little bit, right? But he's really strongly planted to that other foot. So I think that it would be okay for him to kind of have that mass situated such as it is without him feeling like he's unbalanced. So feeling pretty good, but you know, I'll do some drawings and it'll just be like completely like, whoa, it looks like he's doing a cartwheel like the other character was just doing, right? So I'll fix it. Like this guy, this one feels more like he's about to fall backwards. What you can do when you get into more active posing is you can get characters that are off balance, but it looks like they're pivoting. Say, if I'm running and I run around a corner, sort of the momentum will shift and press into my feet more as that mass kind of rounds the corner. I would tilt my body, right? And so I might feel off balance, but if the pose feels like I'm pivoting and turning around something, then it might actually work a little bit better for that. Right? It feels very dynamic at that point. But if it looks like I've just stiff as a board and I'm pivoting, it looks like I'm falling over like a mannequin, right? So have a go with that and see what you can produce, keeping an eye on these things now, thinking about this stuff as much as you humanly can, is just thinking about these things rather than mindlessly making marks. That can be fun. We can do that in our warm-up just to get the kind of hand-eye coordination going. But slowly introduce like thinking about what you see in the model, making sure that when you draw it, it works. Not only because you're seeing it, but because mechanically it would make sense that way, right? And we can tie that into it and you can detect your mistakes sooner, right? Because you know at that point, okay? So outside of that, we're probably going to wrap it up there for today. But some Monday warm-ups for the rest of the week. So like I said, have a play with that and see if it starts to affect the quality of your work as we go forward. Otherwise, have a great week, everybody. Thank you for hanging out with me. And we will be streaming this week. We're going to continue this Thursday with the environment. So we'll have some more fun with that. Start adding texture and making that thing look super sexy. Okay? Awesome. Thanks, gang. Have a great Monday or Tuesday if you're in Australia. And we'll see you next week. Or Thursday. See you then.